Even more famous books are being rewritten to appeal to modern sensitivities, as Ian Fleming's James Bond books are being edited to remove a number of racial references ahead of their 70th anniversary this spring, the Sunday Telegraph reported. Now, Ian Fleming Publications, the company that owns the literary rights to the books, commissioned a review by sensitivity readers to make sure Fleming's literary work appeals to our modern age. The republished James Bond novels will also include a disclaimer describing how terms and attitudes used in the novel might be considered offensive by modern readers, and, quote, a number of updates have been made in this edition while keeping as close as possible to the original text and the period in which it is set.
Whoopi Goldberg denounced the efforts to rewrite historical literature on The View yesterday. Let's watch.
Look, y'all got to stop this, okay? Just put a disclaimer on it that says, listen, this book was written at this time, you know? Or put out the original and what y'all have done, because kids should have the right to read how people thought, so that they know how to make the change. But, you know, they tried to do this with Mark Twain as well, because they were so concerned that the N-word was in the book. Well, that's how they did it. That's what it was. We don't want people doing it today, and you don't see it as much. That's how people learn. Yeah. But maybe I'm crazy, because, you know, I don't know about education anymore.
Preach it, Whoopi.
Team Whoopi on this one.
That was great.
Like, how will the kids know that a book called Octopussy or movie called Octopussy is adult content if there's not a disclaimer on it? I mean, that's the name of the stuff. It's James Bond. It's not fairy tales here.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I think
when I was a kid learning about that, it's called what? What?
I mean, look, it is really, it's not a, part of what angers me or frustrates me about this discourse is that it really isn't about partisanship. I think that when you look at who's covering this story right now, it is a lot of right-leaning magazines, and the implication is that this is like the left's doing and this is what the left loves to do. Nobody normal outside of weird DEI contexts wants this. And for different reasons, right? I think I agree with Whoopi's point that there's a kind of a historical erasure that's going on here that frankly allows people in history, and sometimes very recent history, to pretend that they weren't like very racist and sexist. And I don't think that's a good thing. I was never a big fan of like pulling some of those Confederate statues down during that era of discourse in like 2016-ish. For exactly that reason. And people would argue, well, a lot of these were not actually Confederate era statues. They were put up in the 1950s during a resurgence of, you know, anti-Black racism that was rising around the civil rights protests, and therefore they're not real historical documents and they should be taken down. And I was like, well, no, that means they're a monument to even more recent racism, and we need to be talking about that. I don't know that you can recontextualize them. You can put a plaque. I think there's interesting things you can do, but kind of whitewashing history, I don't think works out for anybody.
No, absolutely not. The gall of these sensitivity readers going through, like, who are these people? Who signs up to do this? It's for the most hall monitor type job ever described, and a lot of publishers are taking them seriously. I've interviewed a Reason magazine where I also write has had pieces by Kat Rosenfeld, who's a writer, brilliant writer, and she's warned about how these things are just ruining publishing entirely. Having to subject your book to uninformed criticism by people, like they'll flag things and go, oh, you know, why did you use? Well, this is you're mixing up ethnic things, and be like, no, you have no idea what you're talking about. It's like uninformed criticism, and it's a train wreck.
Well, look, I think that if an author prior to publishing their book wants to check on things and, you know, wants someone who might have more familiarity with an issue that they don't know about to read their book, I think that's legitimate and a choice that they can make. You know, if I were writing a book about space travel and wanted to pass it by a NASA engineer, I don't think anybody would think that was oppressive or authoritarian. And if I were writing a story that had to do with, you know, traveling to China in 1870, and I wanted to get a historian or, you know, an expert in, you know, Chinese culture to weigh in, then
sure. But the sensitivity readers aren't experts in any of those things. They're just experts in being offended.
Well, I don't know that we can paint with such a broad brush. I think it's perfectly possible for this to be a legitimate area of exploration, like whether or not you hire people who are legitimately qualified. I mean, that's a problem anywhere in the world. You can have issues with people who are legitimately qualified or good at their job. But generally speaking, look, if there's a market for kind of sanitized versions, children's versions of stories, that's one thing. I remember reading children's versions of like Beowulf. Like it was actually called Be a Wolf, and it had that little wishbone dog feature in it when I was a little kid. I mean, that's one thing, right? But it's another thing for
What's the story? Wishbone.
You remember?
I remember those.
I loved Wishbone.
Yeah.
I really wanted a Jack Russell Terrier. But, presenting as the main thing a censored version of a text that can be confused, that's kind of dangerous.
Yeah, and it's so dumb. It's like, who is demanding this? Who says we need to have old James Bond books? Just write new books. Just do different things. Or just take them out of the copyright. Maybe the copyright shouldn't be so like long lasting for these things. And people want to do, like you do The Wizard of Oz. It's out of copyright. Mm-hmm. There's a million Oz spin-off. The Wicked, the musical, comes from, there was a book Wicked that somebody does their own interpretation of it. And that one was actually darker and
more political.
Which is fine. So eventually everything gets to that point. But and the publisher is trying to like re-profit from these things and saying, oh, we need modern audiences. Actually, I wanted to read this quote from Roald Dahl because the discourse on Roald Dahl is what kicked this off last week. Apparently, he said, I saw this on Twitter, he said in 1982, "I've warned my publishers that if they later on so much as change a single comma in one of my books, they will never see another word from me, never, ever." And then he said, "When I am gone, if that happens, then I'll wish mighty Thor knocks very hard on their heads with Mjolnir, or I will send along the enormous crocodile to gobble them up."
That's such a Roald Dahl thing to say. That really, I mean, obviously.
The crocodile and the Mjolnir. No, that's getting into like Loki stuff. Crocodile, Loki,
trying to gobble somebody up, Roald Dahl. Look, obviously, it sheds a different light on the conversation we were having about the editing as text.
Right.
At the time, I said, well, if his estate wants to do this and there's no prohibitions against doing it, they guess they can, but whether they should is
absolutely not.
Yeah, that seems very disrespectful to his wishes, and
it does.
It's a big problem.
Ugh.
But look, I think the silver lining on this is, even Whoopi Goldberg, if you have the ladies of the View agreeing that this is a bad idea, this isn't in fact a culture war issue. This is an HR issue. And I gotta say, the critique of the left that I've been making of identity politics is exactly this. Instead of substantively helping all of the diverse groups that they claim to care about, instead of actually doing things to make sure women have the access to the economy and to make sure historically marginalized peoples have living wages and they have food in their refrigerators and all of those kinds of things, they're spending their time acting like sanitizing James Bond books is going to help a single American materially in this world.
Not going to do anything except give us fodder to complain about for our show.
Amen to that.
More Rising right after this.